Welcome to Cedar Publishing and Media Behind the Scenes. I'm your host, Valerie Lovelace. Every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I will bring you conversations from our Cedar authors. Today I have Robert Line, author of Royal Daughters with Priesthood Power and Endowed with Power, How Temple Symbols Guide Us to Christ's Atonement, which was nominated for the John Whitmer Historical Association LDS Theological Book of the Year. Thanks for joining me today, Robert.
Hey, it's good to be here.
So nice to meet you. Let's talk about your newest book, Royal Daughters with Priesthood Power, 7 Ways Latter-day Saint Women Receive and Exercise the Priesthood. So in the first chapter of the book, you begin by describing a conversation that you had with your mother about where she simply questioned innocently that she didn't understand why women didn't have the priesthood. Is that where the whole question of women in the priesthood started with you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think that's the first time I had heard the question. Certainly as a young man growing up, that was something that would get batted around sometimes in a seminary class or maybe in a class at church. And a lot of times we would just joke about it. In fact, I can remember one time hearing someone say, can women hold the priesthood? Yeah, just go to a dance and slow dance with a teacher or a priest. And so that's usually kind of how that was handled. But I think as far as really taking that question seriously, why do women not hold the priesthood? That was the first time with my mom that I had really considered that. I had just gotten hired as a brand new seminary teacher. I've been in church education now for 27 years. And so this is some 25, 26 years ago when this happened. And I think that was the first time I really seriously considered that question as far as trying to give an answer. And it was the context that my mom, in which she asked the question, she was coming to me as a church educator, as an authority figure, wanting to know, and I didn't know, and that was a real struggle. And so I think that was the beginning, not of hearing the question or considering that question about women in the priesthood, but it was the first time where I was put on the spot, so to speak, and needed to articulate an answer, and it was painful. I was really at a loss.
So would you say that she was your inspiration to write this book?
You know, I think so, in many ways. Not the only inspiration, but she certainly, at that time, that really made me think. It started me on the path to try to find answers to questions. And one of the things I remember, and I mentioned this in the book, is it wasn't so much that my mom asked that question. I had heard the question before, but it was the way in which she asked it. It was so sincere and so vulnerable. And I think that's what made it worse for me, was not being able to respond to this person. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't being sarcastic. She had a genuine need to know, and I didn't know. So yeah, I think you could say that was the beginning, not the only inspiration, but at least the beginning of a quest to try to find answers to that question.
So in the beginning of your book, you talk about that we don't have doctrinal or leadership problems with women. It's more cultural. What are some of these cultural problems that you see? Yeah,
if I could use maybe a little bit of an analogy, it would be the whole issue of blacks in the priesthood. I think there's a good analogy there. You often hear in science all analogies break down. So this one probably will to some extent break down. But it's interesting. Elder Bruce R. McConkie back in 1978, once the revelation on the priesthood for all worthy males came out, he gave a talk. It's a really interesting talk called "All Are Alike Unto God," and he makes a really interesting observation in there. He says, "Look, we spoke with limited knowledge." When he says "we," he's speaking of the First Presidency Quorum of the 12 and previous administrations that denied blacks the priesthood. And he said, we have these scriptures that tell us that all are alike, black, white, bond, free, male, and female. And he says, we never imagined that those scriptures have the broad, extensive meaning that they do. And so when the policy change came with regards to that particular issue, they could see as a quorum and as First Presidency that it wasn't so much a scriptural or a doctrinal problem, but I think there were certain cultural influences. One thing that I'll often tell my BYU students when we bring up, and I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but I'll tie it back into women in the priesthood. But whenever the question of blacks in the priesthood come up, we have a class that I teach at BYU. It's called Foundations of the Restoration. And we have a little unit where we talk about the revelation on the priesthood official declaration too. And often I'll have a student or two that will say, they'll question the racist attitudes of church leaders. And I totally get that. I totally understand it. I've been there. I've felt that angst before, not only as a teacher, but as a student, wanting to know why did we do this? One of the first things I try to share with my students is I say, hey, look, before we level any potential claim of racism on the church or its leaders, let's first acknowledge that the whole country, for 200-300 years was racist. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't excuse anything. That then brings up a whole host of other questions like, well, why doesn't God immediately reveal the truth and have the church correct the nation? That would be an interesting topic to talk about. I think God reveals things line upon line, right? But, as far as your question about no doctrinal problems, no scriptural problems, no leadership problems, I do think we have cultural problems, and I think they persist still today. There's misogynistic attitudes that I see. I think there are certain attitudes that I had growing up. Were those attitudes a result of me being a bad or insensitive person? I'd like to think not, but maybe. But I think it's part and parcel of the culture we've grown up with. I think there is, the hashtag Me Too movement, and there's some really good changes, not just within the church, but within society that I think have helped us as a church to make changes. And so, hope that made a little bit of sense there.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the scriptures and prophetic quotes that I use in the book to talk about women in the priesthood, they've always been there. I'm not teaching anything new per se, although I have a lot of students, once I bring all these things together, all these quotes and statements together, which is what I try to do in the book, I have a lot of students in my classes that are like, wow, I never knew that before. Wow, women really do get to participate in many meaningful ways with the priesthood. But again, to come back to your question, I don't think we have any doctrinal problems or any scriptural problems, but I think there's attitudes that kind of blind us. In the book, I talk about this idea that I think is very dangerous, maybe an old school notion that maybe some people would use, and that is, men hold the priesthood, women have babies, which I think is very insensitive. Women definitely participate in the priesthood, which is what I go into the book, and men participate in procreation, right? Albeit in different ways. And so part of the culture is that insensitivity, and also I think a lack of understanding what the doctrine does say. And fortunately, we have leaders, that I go into the book that have helped us to get a better understanding or a better set of clarification of what the doctrines actually are, so we can overcome those cultural barriers.
And when you say culture, are you referring to culture specifically in the church or society as a whole, or both?
Yeah, I think both. I definitely think that within the church there is a culture. I think there's a strong patriarchal culture that comes, and this is tricky. I don't want to get myself in hot water, but because I'm still a church educator and would like to keep my job. But I think sometimes, I don't think it's so much the doctrine. I think it's our interpretation of the doctrine that then drives certain cultural feelings and misunderstandings, if that makes sense. Because I don't see the church concocting any new doctrines and saying, well, this is how this is a new revelation from God about how he feels about women. I haven't seen that. I think the doctrines are all there in place. And I use an analogy in my book with the atonement of Jesus Christ and his grace and mercy. About 25 years ago, we started making more of an emphasis teaching Christ and his atonement. We used to be accused of this works righteousness in the church when it comes to salvation. And you can definitely see that. I see it in talks that were given in conference, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. I do a lot of research on this stuff. But no one in their right mind would say, well, we're just concocting new doctrines to teach the grace and mercy of Christ. The scriptures, many church leaders and presenters that have started talking more about the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, they're not using anything new. Those scriptures have always been there. And I guess what I'm trying to suggest is I think the same that can be said about women in the priesthood. The doctrines I present in the book and that I see leaders presenting today, it's really nothing new, but I think the way we have interpreted the doctrine and maybe even the way some leaders have interpreted the doctrine in the past, that's created some cultural misunderstandings. Let me read to you, in the book, there's this statement that I have that I just love. And this is a statement made by the first presidency back in 2007. And you can still find this. I think it's on the LDS Newsroom website. But it says, not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. A single statement made by a single leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, but is not meant to be officially binding on the whole church. A couple years ago in conference, President Uchtdorf, he said, some struggle with unanswered questions about things that have been done or said in our past. We openly acknowledge in 200 years of church history, along with an uninterrupted line of inspired, honorable, and divine events, there have been some things said and done that could cause people to question. And then he says this, and to be perfectly frank, there have been times when members or leaders in the church have simply made mistakes. There may have been things said or done that were not in harmony with our values, principles, or doctrine. And so I like how he says that, our values, principles, and doctrines. And so those other things would be the things that I'd say, there's some cultural things that maybe people have said, opinions they've expressed, views that they've had that I think form the bulk of that cultural stuff. And I think that still persists today. I think there's some problems that we still have in the church. I think we're doing better, but I think we have a ways to go. And that was part of my motivation for writing the book.
So how did this start with you? How did you prepare and come to a place where you were ready to write this book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This might seem kind of strange for the audience that's listening to this, but this is my fifth book that I've been able to write and publish. And the thing that's interesting about writing, I heard Gerald Lund, who wrote The Work and the Glory, he said one time, I do some presenting with him sometimes at BYU Education Week, and I heard him say one time that there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting, and that if you want to be a writer, it's not this one shot, one draft thing, it takes a lot of work. Most of my books I will write in a period of about a week or two, if you can believe that. I have to have a time of the year where I have a lot of things off my plate and I can have this big chunk time to write. But it only took me about a week and a half or two to write this book. But the research behind it, that had been done for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. A lot of the stuff in the book I had collected, I had presented in lectures, and it had really been refined by talking with other people. Once you submit a book, it usually then goes through another lengthy process. That's with you guys, Cedar Ford. I also have put my book through a review with Church Correlation. They have a service where we can use that as church educators to have them look at and go over. And so the review process, once I've submitted the manuscript, actually takes a lot longer than even writing the book itself, if that makes sense. But
Wow.
but again, that 1 week, 2 weeks that it took to write the book, that was nothing compared to the 20, 25 years
Right.
that it took to assemble all that stuff. I think it would really be hard for a person to just write a book, like do all the research and then write it. There's a lot of experience and kind of a feel in learning how to link things together. And again, a lot of that came through lectures, presentations that I've given over the course of my whole career.
And what is your background? What have you done that has prepared you for this?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I've been in church education for 27 years. About half that time, especially towards the beginning, that was in seminary, teaching seminary students, and that was some good fertile ground where I think a lot of growth began. But the other half of my career has been in institutes, and I've taught. I was the institute director at Purdue University, did a bachelor's and master's at BYU, did a PhD in sociology of religion at Purdue University, and that was real important training as far as learning how to write better and construct arguments and thinking about interesting theological and sociological questions as they relate to religion. I was on the Institute faculty for 7 years at the University of Utah. That was a wonderful experience. There were some profound lessons that I learned with just some really great mentors there. I was the youngest one on the faculty there for 7 years and was able to rub shoulders with and just connect with many individuals who we would talk about these issues, and it was great getting their thoughts and insights. In addition to that, I've been a professor at BYU, adjunct professor of religion for the past 14 years. And so, and again, this is my 5th book that I've done, so I'd like to think it's not my first rodeo. But so hopefully that's been a pretty good background. I look at this book and the book that I did back in 2017, which is called Endowed with Power, How Temple Symbols Guide Us to Christ's Atonement. I don't think, in fact, I'm pretty sure these 2 books, I could not have written these, definitely couldn't have written them 25 years ago, and I don't even think 15 years ago I would have been able to write them. And so, experience, I think, plays a lot into this, teaching the doctrines, getting not only a feel for the doctrines, but a feel for the spirit behind the doctrines, learning how to present them in the right way with the right tone.
So, I mean, people would assume by the title that you wrote this book for women, but who did you actually write this book for?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think ultimately the book is going to be perceived, and maybe even some of the marketing has been directed towards women, and it certainly is for women, but this book is really for everybody. And in fact, one of my main motivations for writing this was for men. I think a lot of the cultural misunderstanding, going back to that topic that we do have in the church, I think a lot of it's with men, right? And so this book wasn't just me being this, older male figure trying to lecture women on what the doctrine on women in the priesthood is, but this was me seeing some real pain and confusion, not only with some women in the church, but seeing some misunderstandings that men have sometimes, because often, whether it's a priesthood leader or a church educator, not all the time, but the majority of time, we're talking about men who are, dispensing the doctrine there. And I love a quote. We've all heard this before, but President Packer used to say, true doctrine understood changes attitudes and behavior. And I believe that firmly. And part of the reason I wrote this book was not just to give my opinions. In fact, the book is littered with not only scriptures, but prophetic statements. And the idea was, gosh, I need to, my classes that I've taught over the years and taught these principles to, I've literally had students go, why haven't we been taught this before? People need to know about this. In fact, I've had some students say, you ought to write a book about this. That's another impetus for the book, is I've had encouragement from colleagues and students. But, it's always kind of interesting when I get that response from students. Why is nobody talking about this? Why haven't we been taught this before? And I'm sharing scriptures right out of the standard works, and I'm giving them quotes from prophets, seers, and revelators. And so to me, that raises an interesting question. Why are they asking that? Why haven't we been taught this before? Well, there's a reason why they're saying that. They're not hearing the message. And so, that was part of the reason I put the book together, is I thought this message is not getting communicated. President Packer, true doctrine understood changes attitudes and behavior. It's got to be true doctrine, but it also has to be understood. And so I think we've had the truth there, but helping people to understand the doctrine.
It's all a bit scattered, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
It needs to be compiled in one.
Right, and I mentioned that in the book that again, a lot of these doctrines and statements are there, but I just felt this need that it could be a nice resource to compile it all together, bring it all together for people.
So, why don't women have the priesthood? You debunk some of the common theories, myths in your book. What are some of those? Before we tackle the first question, what are some of those common theories? Yeah.
So in the second chapter of my book, I go into some of these theories. One is, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that men hold the priesthood, women have babies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's some serious flaws. I think that's way too simple. Now, do men hold priesthood? Yes. Do women have babies? Yes. But again, I think that totally undermines the relationship. Not only that women have with the priesthood, but that men have in the process of not just procreation, but of being fathers. Mm-hmm. This is God. Everything I hear from the brethren right now is this is a joint venture. Mm-hmm. There is this stress and need of equality between husband and wife, and I don't think this is just because the brethren are trying to concoct a palatable narrative, so we'll resolve some of these cultural concerns. I look back all the way to Adam and Eve, and I think you can trace these doctrines of equality, serving together, working together back then. Again, how we interpret the scriptures is maybe another thing. But another one of the kind of excuses or assumptions, faulty assumptions that I see that people make are this one, and that is, men are just these spiritual brutes. They don't understand anything. Women are more spiritually sensitive.
Which I think triggers some women, because if that is the case, then why are men running
right?
Church?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It doesn't make sense.
No.
And when you really start to understand the priesthood, this is the power of God. It's the power by which worlds are organized. And so it doesn't make sense to me, if the priesthood is such a wonderful thing, that God's going to give this to men because it's this training wheels that they need. And I think some of the people that say that sometimes are men themselves, and it's almost put forth as a panacea or a pretext, of trying to self-deprecate, and make women feel better. It's like, we're the bad ones. We need this thing called the priesthood. And I think that's dangerous. I don't think you can defend that scripturally or doctrinally. And again, I think it paints women in a bad light too, And so, those are some. The other excuse that I sometimes hear from people as to why women don't have the priesthood is, we just need to take it on faith, leave it alone. We're not meant to know. It's kind of that take everything by faith thing. Now, I'm not disparaging that. I think there are some things we need to take on faith, but I always tell my students, it's dangerous when we don't know something and we pretend we do, but it's also dangerous to pretend we do know something when in reality we don't. We got to be careful with that. I think that if there are things and reasons we know as to why God has set certain things up, we need to teach that. But we better be right with it. We can't teach these false narratives. And so if a person wants to say, I don't know, and that's really what I told my mom back 25 years ago, I proffered some strange excuse to her. And ultimately I gave her the I don't know excuse, which was true at the time. And sometimes we have to give that. But President Ballard gave a talk 2.5 years ago. This was in February 2016, and it was a talk to church educators. And he made an interesting statement. He said, "Gone are the days when a student asks a sincere question and the teacher responded by saying, 'Don't worry about it,' or the teacher bore his testimony as a guise to avoid the question, right?" And it was interesting that he said that. He said, "Gone are the days when a student asked a sincere question and we avoided the question that way." He says it's okay to tell students, "I don't know," but then he said we have the duty to research and find the best answers. And so I think we're living in a day and age, especially with this question of women in the priesthood, where people want to know, and there are answers. There are answers in the scriptures. Prophets have given answers, and we need to find out what those are. We can't just go with any of these lame excuses, those three that I went over. Yeah, the kind of this bumper sticker theology. It's really, really dangerous on many levels to both men and women.
Was there ever a time where you think women didn't question why they didn't have the priesthood based on the culture of the time?
Yeah, boy, without transporting myself back 100 or 150 years, I couldn't tell you, but I can from journal entries from some of the Latter-day Saints that I've read. I know there's been a lot of faithful women over the years who have had that question, and I think who have put the faith, I'm going to go alone on this by faith, at the forefront of their thoughts. But have they had the question? Oh yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
I think so. I can't help but wonder. I am sure people of African American descent back in the days of slavery, I bet every one of them asked that question. Mm-hmm. Why are things the way they are? I don't know. I'm not them, but I can't help but think the answer to that would be yeah, absolutely. I think that now I do think that in the church, with this question of women in the priesthood historically, and I say this out of anecdotal experience from talking with my mom, with grandparents, aunts and uncles, I do think there was a real healthy culture in the church 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago of suppressing things. You don't talk about those things. Mm-hmm. We just take it on faith. And
do you think that's a counterculture to the women's movement at that time? Because that would have been around the same time.
It could be, but I think that was the way things went with a lot of issues in the church. I'll give you one example of that in my research for my Endowed with Power book. As I talked with a lot of people and as I researched and as I wrote that book, part of what, if I can take off on a little tangent, part of the reason I wrote my temple book was to help people with some of the more difficult esoteric teachings in the temple themselves, mm-hmm. As to why are we doing certain movements and actions and gestures and things. And, we don't talk about those things outside of the temple, but it got to the point where we weren't talking about anything mm-hmm. outside of the temple. President Benson gave a talk one time and he says, that's unhealthy. We need to be talking. We need to be preparing our youth for this. We have temple prep classes. In the preface to my book, I say, my favorite thing about the best thing about a temple prep class is not the temple prep class itself. It's the scriptures. That's the best part of temple prep. And the temple prep classes, I think, are great, but they primarily prepare a person to go to the temple. In my opinion, they don't prepare one to be in the temple. Mm-hmm. When I was a bishop of a young single adult ward, not always, but often I would get young men, young women who got endowed, even after having all the temple prep classes, they would come back and it was like, wow, what was that with the endowment? What? And not everyone responds that way. Some people are great, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who was like that perfectly understood everything that was going on in the endowment. They have questions. But to go back, I think 40, 50 years ago, that same type of an attitude, don't ask questions, don't question the authorities, don't entertain any type of questions. That was kind of the culture, not just with women in the priesthood, but with temples and other things that weren't understood. Does that make sense? And so I think the whole, let's not ruffle feathers, let's not question things, let's not go too deeply, I think all of that was part of the culture. But today, you look at the church leaders, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, all about transparency, right? They want to get the information out there. We live in this age of technology where everything is available on the internet from every possible point of view, President Ballard says. And so we've got to get control of the narrative. It's not that we want to lead people to things that are not true or cover-ups or whitewashing, but it's if people are going to have access to every bit of information on the internet, we better be catching up with it. And so the church has made I think wonderful strides in trying to be more transparent. When you're transparent, it does go against this culture in the past of not asking questions. Just let's not go too deeply. Let's not think about it too much. And so I think part of what we're going through today is this process. There's a struggle. I think part of it is this older generation that kind of has that. I love all my older aunts and uncles and grandparents and whatnot. But there is a culture there. I've talked with them about this before, this struggle, and I'm getting older too. I'll just admit that. I'm in my 50s now. But there's this angst of not wanting to go too deeply versus millennials and the rising generation where they want to know everything. In a lot of my classes, you not only need to be careful about what you say, but students know how to fact check things so quickly. They get that phone out if they have a question, and bam, they'll call you on it too. And I think it's a wonderful thing. That's helped me as a teacher, to be very accurate. But see, that's the type of culture we're in. That's why I think President Ballard said, gone are the days when you can just tell someone, don't worry about it, or you just bear your testimony. We've got to find answers, and there are answers out there to these questions.
This is kind of a hard question. I almost don't want to ask it.
You're going to put me on the spot, huh?
Yeah. Is this book meant to placate women who have questions about not having the priesthood? Yes. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think it's helpful in the first instance to have a dialogue of, I think it goes back to some of these cultural missteps of men hold priesthood, women have babies. That's not the case at all. I think people who read this book, especially when they get to chapter 3 is when I really go into the guts of the book. In fact, chapter 3 is the subtitle, 7 Ways Latter-day Saint Women Receive and Exercise the Priesthood. One of those, I think women are becoming more familiar with. It's the President Oaks thing that he's been teaching a lot lately. And a lot of people have been quoting President Oaks, and that is when a woman receives any calling in the church, she receives priesthood authority to perform a priesthood function. I could see if someone said that, well, we're just placating women. And I will, let me come back to be very fair and honest with your question. And I know some people that have concerns, even after reading my book, they would go right to the issue of, well, women aren't ordained to offices of the priesthood, and they don't hold the upper leadership positions in church, which they don't. I get a lot of students that ask, do you think that'll change? And I tell them, I don't know, have no idea. That's up to God and up to prophets. I don't think it's to placate. I think this is more to inform.
I had a friend of mine one time in high school, and every time we would get in a discussion, or if he'd get mad at me about something, he'd say things like, "Oh, you never include me as a friend," which was totally not true. He was using hyperbole to express disappointment with one incident when I didn't include him, right? And I'd always call him out. I'd say, wait, I never include you as a friend. Sometimes people say things like that. Maybe a wife says to her husband, "You never do the dishes." Well, wait. I do them a lot. Do I do them all the time? No. Did I not do them the one time I was supposed to? And so part of it's semantics, but see, semantics can often create friction in relationships. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with this book is to be very clear about semantics and understanding, and say, when we start saying women don't participate in the priesthood, that's absolutely not true. Women do participate in some very real ways. Some of these other 7 ways that I talk about in the book, I think some women will be stunned to find out about some of the real ways they not only participate with priesthood, but how they receive priesthood, authority, and power. Women actually enter into an order of the priesthood called the New and Everlasting Covenant of Priesthood. Joseph Smith called it a third priesthood order. There's Aaronic, Melchizedek, and patriarchal order. Those of your listeners that are listening to this podcast, I would have them go to section 131, verses 1 through 2. It says it very clearly, this order of the priesthood, meaning the New and Everlasting Covenant of the priesthood. I not only bring that scripture up in the book, but we go into many prophetic statements that help us to better understand that. The Melchizedek priesthood is not the highest priesthood, it's the higher priesthood. The highest order of the priesthood is the patriarchal order, which men and women enter into together. A lot of Latter-day Saints don't know that. And that one, and the calling, receiving priesthood authority in your calling, that's just 2 of the 7 ways. And again, I think my hope is that both women and men that read this book will go, wow, there is a lot of ways in which women really do participate in and with priesthood. And so, no, I don't think it's trying to placate women. I think this is to inform, and again, as I've said before a couple times, to inform men as well, so that they teach the doctrine correctly.
When someone picks up this book, they may want to, like we were speaking about before, see that one-liner about, make me feel better about this, why women don't have the priesthood. But this book really doesn't have it. It's a compilation of a lot of information that has to be studied and really, really thought about. And I think I'm probably going to have to read it a couple of times until I feel comfortable, understanding all of the principles that are in this book.
Right. Right at the end of my first chapter, if I could just read this, I write this little statement here. I realize that what I share in this work could be very sensitive, so I plead for patience, faith, and understanding as we begin this venture of discovering what our Heavenly Father has said through inspiration about His royal daughters having and exercising priesthood power. I tried to balance being sensitive in the church, because you can be sensitive with someone, but at the same time, there's a lot you have to process, to come to understanding. I hated studying calculus in high school and college, but I had to for the education that I went through. It wasn't easy, and it took a lot of effort. Now, some might argue and they might say, I just want the gospel to be simple. I've even heard people teach that before. Oh, the gospel, the thing I love about the gospel, it's simple. It's interesting if you look at 2 Nephi 31, verses 1 through 3, Nephi doesn't rejoice because the gospel's simple. He says, I rejoice in plainness. Mm-hmm. I'll often tell my students, what's the difference between something that's simple and something that's plain? There's a difference there. Nephi doesn't rejoice in the simplicity of the gospel. He rejoices in the plainness of it. What I mean by that is this. Someone who understands calculus, it's simple to them, relatively speaking. But it's definitely, or I should say it's plain for them. I misspoke there. But it's definitely not simple, you know. And so, yeah, the gospel is plain on many levels, but it's definitely not simple. There's a lot of study. I think this is why we have church, we have quorums, we have Relief Society, we have Seminary, Institute, we have so many General Conference. We're told constantly to read the scriptures each day. There is a lot. Isaiah 55, God's ways are higher than our ways. And so although the gospel is plain, Nephi delights in plainness. It's definitely not something that's simple. And so, it's interesting that you had mentioned that. I think that people, when they read this book, you want to go into it almost, I don't want to suggest my book is like the scriptures, but you almost have to read it with that diligence because there's a lot packed in. I have a few stories to kind of try to illustrate things. But ultimately, when a person goes through and reads it, there's really a lot to digest, especially chapter 3. The whole thing. You get into chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. There's a lot of meat there to digest.
Yeah, I mean, you cover some really heavy topics like Heavenly Mother.
Yeah.
For one, you talk about gender roles.
Yeah.
Some really heavy topics in there that I don't think that the average person could unpack all of that in one afternoon.
Right. You know, it's kind of interesting. This past, we just got done with the October conference, 2019, wonderful conference. And obviously the Saturday evening session of conference was the women's meeting. Mm-hmm. The men's will be this coming April. It was so funny. My wife and my daughters all commented. In fact, several of my daughters right in the middle of it were like, Dad, everything they're teaching in this session is in your book. And so I think they hit on a lot of these topics. In fact, when I went back, I've read some of the summary articles on Deseret News, and just about every single topic I bring up in my book. And so some people said, man, your book's really timely. And that's part of the reason you write a book, right? Because it's timely and people are asking questions. But a lot of just for your listeners and people that'll read the book, I think they'll find a really close connection of these things that were spoken, not just in conference, but specifically in the women's session of conference.
And, I told you before we started that I talked to my mom extensively about this before. My mom is wise and knowledgeable. Hello, Mom. And
hi, Mom.
And so I bounce a lot of things off of her. And she says, well, they talked a lot about that in conference. And I said, well, I listened to conference. I don't particularly remember anything. She says, oh, the women's conference. I was like, oh, well, that's why I've only gotten through half of it because I have children. And so I always have to listen to that one later.
Right.
But, so I've heard from you and her that women's conference covered this topic extensively, and that would be a good...
Yeah, I think women that, listen to the conference and women that still will finish listening, there's some wonderful precepts taught there, but if you want to really deepen and enrich your understanding of those things they taught, the book would be my book would be a really good resource to to be able to go back and to explore those doctrines and to have kind of the nuts and bolts behind each specific thing that they said with references, quotes, scriptures, to be able to say, oh, they're not just making this up. That really is the doctrine. I'll give you one example of that. So the young women, they're doing away with the old theme, right? We are daughters of our Heavenly Father. He loves us and we love him. However, did I get it right? I don't know if I got it right there. It's something like that's the old one, right?
You mixed up the order, but all of those words are said in it.
Right. However, the order goes, well, that's gone now, and now they're going to have a completely new, young women's theme or motto, whatever they call it, that they're going to recite. And one of the things that they mention in there is I think it's not the we anymore, but I think they use the I word. I am a daughter of heavenly, and it's not of Heavenly Father, but of heavenly parents you see. Yeah, and so I got one, you know this, but I have one whole chapter in the book about Heavenly Mother, and so I go into that, and again, that's not just a me thing. I'm going into scriptures, statements from prophets, and a lot of people will say, well, we have one hymn on Heavenly Mother. There's actually 3 hymns that we have on Heavenly Mother in the hymn book. And so people who read the book, I present those hymns in there. So they'll be able to go in and not just with that topic, but a lot of these topics and really be able to add some meat to them.
So I've been blessed my whole life. I was raised in the church by goodly parents, and I've been lucky to be around men, not just my father, but leaders as well. They never treated me like a second-class citizen in the church. But, however, other women have not had the same experiences as myself. Abuse is rampant all over the world, and it's inside and outside of the church. Have you considered the impact that this abuse has on women and their want to be part of the priesthood?
Right. That's a really good question. There is a chapter in the book that I do on equality, understanding equality, and I think there will be some material there, some resources, some quotes from prophets where they talk about this idea of unrighteous dominion and the extreme damage that it does. That's hard for me to talk about that question, right? Being male, and I've never been on the other side, obviously. I had loving parents, and I've tried to be a loving father to my children that I have. And so again, I would say, I think it comes back to this statement by President Packer, true doctrine understood changes attitudes and behavior. People who have had negative experiences might not even want to pick up this book.
Right.
They might not even be interested in even knowing. But my question would be, where do you start? Maybe a person that has had some extreme bad experiences, and I want to be very careful with this, but the church is very sensitive to this, but that have had bad experiences not just with maybe a father figure, but maybe with a church leader. Very few, right? We see some churches out there. Catholic Church is they're having some really tough things come up now, right? Over the past 15, 20 years with priestly abuse and whatnot. And I'm not suggesting anything of that level goes on in our church, but in the introductory chapter to my book, I share 2 stories of women, dear friends of mine, who had not overtly abusive situations, but negative experiences. And part of the reason I wanted to include their voices and their stories, both of them wanted to be anonymous, which I understand. I wanted to hear their real feelings, and I knew I needed to do that. I needed to share a story like my mom's. I share some other stories in the book, some of my own stories where I was insensitive to my wife. We have a chapter in the book about priorities and how we balance those as husband and wife. And I share a story in there that's where I'm the bad guy and treated my wife maybe not in an abusive way, but in a way that was a little crass and
or dismissive.
And dismissive, yeah. And so I abuse can come in a lot of forms, not just physical and violent type of abuse, but neglect.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent word to describe it.
Yeah, verbal abuse.
And I think that's what a lot of women in the church, how they may describe how they're feeling about this issue,
right,
is neglect.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, so I'll be honest, one of the, probably shouldn't say this, but I will. My book, in producing it, gets reviewed, I said by Church Correlation. It's actually this doctrinal review committee within church education. They're part of Church Correlation. And it's just a couple of employees that are helping, that are really good, real qualified type editors that are giving me suggestions. In the introductory chapter to the book, where I share those stories of those two women, they were a little concerned about that I was sharing those stories. And part of their concern, and I totally understand this, is they didn't want me to put the church in a bad light. Mm-hmm. And I totally understood that. But at the same time, I wanted it to be a little gritty. People who read the first chapter, it's a little gritty. I've tried to keep it real. And part of what I say in there is, I'm not trying to be negative towards the church or its doctrines, but these are real people.
Right.
These are real people that have real sincere feelings. I've had students before. I've had daughters of mine, and my wife included, who's salt of the earth, 100% committed to the church and very active, that have real questions. Mm-hmm. They're not trying to be negative. They're not trying to be naysayers. They're not trying to be hypercritical. Quite the opposite. They're wanting to find a reason to continue to support, to stay in.
Right.
Yet they have real feelings and questions. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book is to air those and say, look, doctrine is good. Leadership is good. Scriptures are good. Culture, bad. we misunderstand the scriptures, and we've got some attitudes and some, at times, some abusive issues that we need to come to grips with.
I thought they were a great example of, like you said, you wrote this book for men as well. It's not just for women; it's
right.
for everybody. And men aren't always going to see what women are going through. We are often, split in different classes, with Relief Society and Elders Quorum and that sort of thing. And so I thought they were great examples to any men reading the book of what some, probably not the usual, but some women are going through, how we're being made to feel. So
right. And one of the things I mentioned in the first chapter of my book is that I realize that what I present in here, it's not gonna heal. It's not gonna solve every problem mm-hmm. like that. But again, my hope is to maybe be a resource to get a beginning of correct knowledge out there. Yeah, true doctrine understood changes attitudes and behavior. It's got to be true doctrine. It's got to be understood, but it's got to be true too. It can't be based on false narratives, Mm-hmm. And so, and that's all. This book is not an end all. It's a resource, But hopefully, it'll be a resource that can meet a lot of different people at where they're at.
So I've got one more question for you, and it's a tough one, and then we'll end the interview there. I'll let you have the final words. But with the changing of society and the way the civilized world works as a whole, wanting to see women out of the house, making wages, helping with making a living, they don't want men and fathers in the home, or they don't have those opportunities. And contrast that with the church urging women to do what they can to stay home, to teach their children on their own. How do we tackle these tough issues when we are becoming more and more unusual from the world around us?
Right. That's really good. It I think a lot of it has to do with how we define ourselves. Um, I wonder. You go back to high school. Boy, how many of us knew people that if you asked them, "Who are you?" Well, I'm an athlete. I'm a cheerleader. I'm in band. Back in high school, it was really easy to define ourselves as an athlete or whatever. And no, we're all children of God. I think that's where we have to start. I'm a child of God. Who are you? Oh, I'm a lawyer. Oh, I'm a career professional. There is so much status and notoriety and prestige associated with, being a professional and being a leader and this and that. One of the quotes I have in my book, and yeah, again, people have probably heard this, but I think it was Joseph Fielding Smith said the greatest calling of all is that which has been given to women as mothers of the children of God. And I really believe that. I had an interview. I got a phone call one day about 5 years ago, and it was a person doing a political survey, and they went through a lot of different questions, and they got to abortion, and they said, "Okay, are you pro-life or pro-choice?" And it was a young lady that was interviewing me, and I said, "I'm neither." And she was like, she got frustrated, and she says, "Well, what would you more identify, pro-life or pro-choice?" Well, in the church, I think the majority of us tend to be pro-life in the sense that we're not looking to, have abortions every single time, but we do recognize that there are some exceptions to that, right? When the life of the mother is in danger, rape, incest. We know, and we've been taught by our leaders that there. And so, should there be laws for those few instances? Yeah, I guess so. But I wouldn't respond. I didn't want to pin myself down to a bumper sticker, pro-life, pro-choice. So I told this young lady interviewing me. I said, "Can I tell you what I am?" She says, "Okay." And I said, I'm pro-natalist. And she had no idea what I meant by that. I said, "I'm pro-natalist." And I go, "Do you know what I mean by natalist?" And she goes, "Babies? Having babies?" And I go, "Yeah, I believe in having children. I believe that's part of God's plan. And it takes both men and women jointly. And I think we've got to figure that out. It's got to be done with dignity, right? It's got to be done with love. It's got to be done with compassion. It can't be done in arrogance, flippancy, disregard of each other. Men absolutely should not disparage women or demean them or abuse them in any way, but I think it goes both ways. And women have received the brunt of that throughout history, right? And I can see that. I agree with it, but I think we've got to get to the point where we look at God's plan and we say, you know what? This is not about me identifying myself as, oh, I'm a career person. Oh, I'm the breadwinner. Oh, I'm this, that. No, we're children of God. First and foremost, we're children of God. And we've been given this wonderful opportunity to come to earth and to have children, to bring children here. That's sacred. And I think we've got to find a way to enthrone that. And then we'll deal with the other stuff. I just feel that it's unfortunate that, and men are guilty of this in the church, of thinking they're somehow superior because they get to hold the priesthood. And I guess in writing this book, I want people to understand, no, we're all in this together. Women participate in priesthood in many ways, and they're real ways and they're important ways. And we need to see that. We need to recognize that. We need to treasure it and value it and not use it as an excuse. And we need to accept the fact, too, that men are in this family thing with women, raising children, rearing children. I think in some of the latter chapters in the book, those that read this will see that the doctrine of the church is not women do this, men do that. We're all in it together. And are there some nuances? Yeah, there's some nuances there. But hopefully we approach these roles and these things together in love and in real, true understanding.
Thanks again for joining me today, Robert.
Thank you.